Hello, I'm Jim Miller. I'm here with Terrence Moore. The FlipSide starts right now. Welcome to the show. Tonight we are pleased to welcome City Council person Kristen Aleshire. Kristen, you've been with the city now a long time as a councilman. You keep getting reelected. Anyone that has heard the level of knowledge you bring, I don't think that's probably a surprise for most people. So welcome. Glad to have you here.
Yep, 2001, I think.
Wow.
So yeah.
There's a lot going on in the city, and obviously what has consumed a lot of the news cycle in the past year on the positive side is the new stadium, the new multi-use sports facility. Is that what they're calling it?
Yeah.
And also we've got some new restaurants. We've got, since the last time you've been on, the Maryland Theater has done the upgrade, which I know is a couple years ago now. We've got continued success at the Barbara Ingram School for the Arts. We've got the museum that's doing a major expansion project. There's a lot going on.
Yeah, I don't think just there. I don't think just downtown. I think we forget a little bit that we have, probably 6 to 12 housing developments. So, some years have passed since we've had that level of residential activity. And, obviously, across the state you see the housing demand. I'd like to tell people that before COVID, in Washington County, we had somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,200 to 1,600 houses on the market. Post-COVID, it dropped to like 250 houses on the market.
Wow.
So, there just isn't enough housing to meet the demand for people that want to buy houses and rent and things like that. And so we're starting to see some of that demand, those market rate houses, moving forward now up and down the 81 corridor, even across from Virginia Avenue. That's a 451 housing development. And then the other component that you don't see, or don't talk about a lot outside of that downtown core is we have about 9 what I guess people refer to as warehouses. So those 9 warehousing locations, they bring in a lot of revenue. They provide a lot more jobs than I think people realize. In just about every shift, during the day. And so I think that those things have added to our ability within our tax structure to be able to afford to do some of those other things that you talk about.
Excellent.
I'm going to take a step back and set the stage for conversation for the rest of the evening here. You said you served since 2001. Mm-hmm. Why? Why do you do what you do? Why do you keep why do you keep putting your name in a hat?
It's certainly not the paycheck, right?
So it's fine. So I've been asked that question over and over. Probably just every 4 years. I left a short time to be a county commissioner, and then I wasn't invited back, and I was happy about that because county government is not city government. There are 2 huge differences. The first is municipal government is a much more autonomous operation. You get to make laws, you get to conduct activities that you don't have to go to the state legislature and sort of ask to do all of those things. And the other thing is the county's a big place. It may seem small to folks that live here, but when you're a county commissioner, the county's a big place, and it's hard to enact true and real and tangible change in those outskirt areas that you just don't see that often. So it's much different. But for me, it's real simple. When I was 25, which is when I first got elected to city council, I had all kinds of friends, at that time that were just deciding what they wanted to do in life and where they wanted to go. And most of their answers was somewhere other than here, right? That was the answer. But me, I love the city. I love Hagerstown. I love being from here, and I love being here. And it was real simple. I didn't want to wake up in 20 years and go, man, I could have changed some of these things. You know, I could have had an impact on some of these things. And so I just felt at that time, and I think I still feel now that, you know, there is no better time than immediately to get involved and do that. So.
In that time, your greatest accomplishment?
So I think that depends on the administration. I think if you'd asked me, you know, 8 or 9 years ago, I would often say tearing down MELP. Everybody remembers that big ugly building,
Yes.
and it had to go. And so, you know, that was a pretty significant thing, because I remember that as a kid and thinking, you know, wow, that, you know, that shouldn't be like it is. But I think maybe now, a bit selfishly, and you know, I think most of the folks that were able to accomplish this task, I like seeing the indoor turf complex. I think it is a benefit to the community. I'll be very frank, just as I said at the opening day, it was a dream of my father's. A lot of us as kids were taken to all kinds of really cool places like that all over the East Coast to play and participate in those types of sporting and recreational activities. And the thought was always, you know, why does everybody have to leave here to go somewhere else to do that? Why can't it be here? And so I feel like that was a pretty big accomplishment.
And you've been an advocate for a number of years that I've known you to lead. And off air a little bit, we started talking about some of that, how some learning experiences that took you into that initiative. Can you share a little bit more about that?
The learning experiences?
Yes.
Like?
As far as, this is a big deal, right? In that indoor turf arena, I'm sure when you first
Compared
proposed
to
it,
the ice.
compared.
Okay, so you know, when I first, you know, I'm 50 this year, and so I look back at that 25-year-old version of myself, and I think of like a lot of the answers that I gave to questions, you know, on a gambit of local municipal politics oriented items, and I use this example. We could look back and say, okay, if we'd like to engage in this big venture item, what are some things we should do this time more correctly than we may have done in the past on other initiatives? The ice rink is probably an example of that, where I wasn't around when the ice rink was created, but that initiative had some significant differences. It was privately pushed. It was publicly sort of funded, owned, operated, managed, and placed under governmental operations. And that venture, with government being the individual sole entity of that process throughout its duration, simply didn't go great. Government did not do a great job in that private venture project. So this time, we're like, okay, we own the land, but we don't want to be the builders, owners, operators of this. Let's go find a professional entity, an outfit that does these things. And Eastern Sports Management came in and said, you know, we'd like to be that partner, right? And I think a thing that people don't know and that I've shared before is, so a couple of years back when we first engaged this, we were going to do it on the golf course. That was one of the options. And nobody wanted to consider the stadium property because the whole baseball thing was still up in limbo. And Eastern Sports Management came, they left, come back a couple of years later, you know, we're sort of pushing it again. The stadium had sort of picked its place, and Frederick Indoor Sports Complex, which is where I was playing at the time, they had sold and wanted to sort of sell out, and COVID hit, things sort of fell south for them in that operation there. The owner wanted to sell, and he was in process of selling. We were sort of on the cusp of committing to doing this. And Frederick sort of went to the owner of the Frederick government sort of went to the owner of Fisk and the Frederick community, said, hey, please keep this open. And Frederick government, for whatever reason, I think made the decision not to engage in taking over that facility and keeping it up and running. And I think they got some community pushback, right? Mm-hmm. Well, within the time that it closed and it got that community pushback, we made the decision to pull the trigger, to proceed and lock in Eastern Sports Management and, you know, get them on board. And the Frederick folks sort of called Eastern Sports Management and said, hey, would you like to come down here and reconsider because the community really wants to keep this thing open? And he said, I'm sorry, I've already committed to Hagerstown and they're moving forward. And so, you know, it was a bit serendipitous that we, you know, stayed that course and you know, arrived at having the product that we do that brings people here rather than our people going there.
Timing is everything.
In tenure.
It is.
I think that's what I wanted to point out, that having that tenure, you learn and you get to adapt and apply it to future initiatives. But, you know, it's sometimes difficult if you don't know the history and how to bring some of those learnings forward when you make strategic decisions for the city.
I think that another good example of that is our parking decks. You know, we have 3 parking decks, and I've said before, and I say it again, and I pushed, you know, for years I pushed for the parking deck that is now next to the baseball stadium. Even before that was an idea, because when we looked at other cities, Annapolis and Frederick and Salisbury and others, you know, the success of their core clearly was bolstered by the number of parking decks that they were able to offer to this huge developed infrastructure of buildings and houses and commercial spaces that you just can't revamp without appropriate levels of parking. And, you know, I remember when I was first going to be, you know, I was first candidate, 2001, and I was looking at our funding for our parking structure for the, we call it the university deck, but it's the first deck we had. Mm-hmm. And I was like, wow, it will take us 47 years past the construction debt service of this deck to be retired for that deck to ever break even. I said, we cannot operate parking deck infrastructure this way. You know, I mean, we can't depend on the tax structure to subsidize that process, you know, and expect to be able to build the next parking deck and build the next parking deck. Right. It has to be some type of financial structure. So the second deck came along and we built a smaller deck, probably smaller than we should have in the Arts and Entertainment District. Mm-hmm. And I said at that time, and it was a 3-2 vote to proceed. And the only way I was able to get 3 people is I was able to convince enough to say, listen, at least 35% of that deck's revenue has to come from the deck itself. And so I was able to get 3 people on board to agree with, okay, if that's the structure we're going to go with financially, I can at least support that idea because I'm not placing that burden entirely on the taxpayer. Fast forward to this most current deck, and you know, we got some pushback about the cost for that, but we have to keep that parking fund as solvent as possible so that we can venture into that next, you know, area of parking structure that we want to build, which would be on the northwestern section of our core.
And parking decks aren't sexy, right?
No.
I mean, they're not big initiative, but they are infrastructure that recruit businesses. It became critical to even the stadium being located because a certain amount of parking spaces had to be available for that structure to actually even be built or even be considered for its current location. So again, it's one of those things where you have to think outside the box and do some of the things that maybe not be as flashy as others, but that's where municipal government comes into play. It's making those decisions for recruiting businesses and retaining them, and of course longevity.
Yeah. Well, and the reality is, at least for me, and I'll state this as a personal opinion, I don't like parking on the street. I have no problem parking in the deck. I don't like parking on the street. I just don't.
I think that's probably the general sentiment, which is the opposite of what people typically feel when they go to the mall, right?
Right.
You know, you just have that expectation. You go to Target or the mall, whatever. But when you go to an urban setting downtown, your expectation, when I took my daughter to Charleston, right, It's like, okay, where's the parking deck?
Where's the
Because
parking
that's
deck?
where I'm going to park
That's right.
at in this
I don't even
urban
if there's a
setting.
space open on the street,
Yeah.
if I'm close to the deck, I'll go to the
It
deck.
just seems confusing and busy and unfamiliar, and you're like, okay, if I get into this space, then I have the comfort of driving, parking in a space, and being at that spot. And so, those are things that I think we have to continue to do, because I think, before we did our third parking deck, there was still, I think, a total of more than 1 million square feet of marketable space within our buildings downtown, and you can't get that space reoccupied, unless you're able to provide, that type of parking and those types of parking facilities.
We need to take a break,
Okay.
but when we come back, we'll have more with Councilperson Kristen Aleshire. Stay with us. Welcome back. Once again, we're here with Councilman Kristen Aleshire. Kristen, thanks for hanging out with us. A lot of good information. Let's start talking about strategy. Toss it to you, Terrence.
We know the city council meetings they're a little dry television, right?
A little bit.
Yeah.
So let's take a big picture. Let's talk about strategy. Let's talk about your vision. What is your vision for our community, our community core, and even well outside of it? As you mentioned, I know we take a lot of focus of our downtown, but you're responsible for a much larger area in the community. So what do you see in your vision? Give us 5-year, 10-year, whatever works.
Well, for me, I guess because I work in municipal government, I plainly see government's responsibility in 2 ways. It is there to provide the infrastructure, and it is there to provide those basic governmental services, that complement that infrastructure that people use. That's just how I feel
Give us
about
an
it.
example.
So infrastructure, your street system, your roads.
Right.
When I look at Southern Boulevard and Halfway Boulevard and Eastern Boulevard, those things should be constructed in a way to provide for future growth. They should all be dualized, lanes in all directions. We should think that way in their interconnectivity. Our our developments should not be full of cul-de-sacs. Neighborhoods should connect to one another. And we've got to get out of that thought process, that everybody wants to live in a cul-de-sac. And we have made a lot of bad decisions not interconnecting our neighborhoods, which then create traffic difficulties, as we saw today, for that traditional grid system for people to get around and into those and through those major thoroughfares. So that's an example of infrastructure. Services is obviously, public safety, and public works. Parks and things like that people expect some degree of service level from. And so for me, when I think of the next 5 to 10 years, and I know my council colleagues laugh at me sometimes because I have this book, right, and I always take it around, and I have the to-do list in this book, and I have in process, in one section, and things on the horizon in the next section. And for me, my objective is to take each item in that book, complete that item, and put it in a file and move on to the next item.
Project management
I
101.
just believe that that's government's responsibility. So, when we complete the field house, it's done, you put it over here, and okay, what's the next idea and objective? And if it's a parking deck, if it's the YMCA, and so I think that you're able to interlink those project-oriented items with your activity-oriented, your legislative-oriented items, and say, okay, we got to keep these priorities moving along, and we've got to accomplish them, and then move on to the next one. And obviously, the YMCA was one of those sort of big-ticket items that hit the news this week, even though we've been talking about it publicly for a number of weeks. The city has, in my opinion or my idea, and it's funny because, and folks don't know this, so I'm going to tell you now, I went to the county commissioners when the property originally went up for auction, and I said, listen guys, and I went to the city council and I went to the county commissioners and said, hey everybody, before this property goes up to auction, or goes into foreclosure or whatever and is going to be locked away again for another 20 years, there are two realities. One, private development by itself is not going to make a go of this property. It's just way too big. And two, if we miss this opportunity, you know what I mean, it may not come along again anytime soon. And everybody that's from this community that remembers the YMCA has a fond memory of the activities at that YMCA, and everybody wants to see it be anything other than what it is right now and what it's been for the last 20 years. That's a reality. And so if we can work with that property owner to get that property a reasonable price and then are able to market it to private developers, not the county, not the city developing it or redeveloping it. We're not putting our money into it. At the end of the day, we work with a private developer to put that back into positive, private, productive use, then we've accomplished that goal. And we provide the ability for private developers to have access to our state and federal partners that they otherwise wouldn't have access to for a project of that magnitude. And so we brought in Jake Day from DHCD, and we showed them the property, and so it just, I think it confuses me a little that we sort of put this idea out in the public ethos there, and immediately there's this response of, oh my gosh, here goes the city, they're going to run this into the ground, they're going to lose this, they're going to do that, without ever just listening for a moment, asking a question, what's the plan? And I just have to, I was thinking to myself today, and I called the mayor and talking to others, and I'm like, if I've got to go it alone on this, then that's what we do, and we see if we can make a go of it, right? And if we don't at the end of the day, if 60 days come up and it doesn't happen, we tried. And if 18 months comes up and we sell it, at even a marginal loss, we've made a sincere attempt to make it absolutely better than what it is now. And I think that we're at this juncture where we're sort of vetting that possibility, and it isn't. I don't look at it in a vacuum, right? Mm-hmm. Just that one property. I look at it as how do we look at that catalyst building in that property and expand, into that area. We've expanded, South Potomac. We need to expand North Potomac. We talked about parking decks. Is there a possibility for that opportunity there on property we own? And see if that's a possibility.
Couple of things. First, just from public perception, hearing things in layman's terms helps a lot more. I think there's a very high level of speak when initiatives are communicated, as they should, especially when people are looking in. And I think people tend to fill the gaps with the negative. They assume the worst.
I agree.
And
I agree.
It becomes a doomsday kind of event. Hearing you even explain it in that capacity sounds completely different than what it would traditionally sound like when you're in a working session.
I'll give you an example. Hub City Vinyl. People don't remember, right? People don't remember that just a few short years ago, we rebuilt the library, and I went to the county commissioners. When I got back on city council, I went to the county commissioner and I said, hey, those two houses that are falling into the street that are on that property you own with the old Massey building need to go. You're looking out this back window of this beautiful library, and you see these two houses falling into the street, and nobody wants to touch it because, maybe some historic house. Nobody wants to touch the Massey building because it needs $1.5 million roof. And nobody, everybody sort of freezes. And I said, we've got to do something. We've got to make this move. And so we cited the county, I believe, for not addressing the dilapidated houses. And they eventually said, here, city, take this property, it's yours. And we took down the houses. The Jewish community came in and said, hey, we'd like to do, this Kennedy Park. We got this beautiful park there now. And we sold the Massey building for $30,000. We didn't put the millions into it. but we created the opportunity for private development to make that happen. Now, you can go back in the books and probably find that the city and county probably invested about $1.3 million into buying all that property originally and sold it for $30,000 between the two. But somebody else then put millions of dollars, you know what I mean, into that effort to reinvest in that private property. And that's, you look at the Massey building versus the Y, they're two very, very different sized investment structures, right? But even if at the end of the day, and I know people are going to be upset when I say this, if we purchase this property for 2.5, and let's say at the end of the day we sell it to a developer who can make a go of it for a $15 million project for $1.5 million, and we lose $1 million, we've gained that $15 million investment. It's not much different than the $250,000 that we do in our first third program if somebody invests $500,000. We did it with Schmankelstube, we did it with the Patterson, you know what I mean? We've done that, and we've been able to garner. We spent $1 million, and we've garnered about $6 million of private investment. It's no different. It's just on a much larger scale.
And that goes back to the same thing. I think it's communication and understanding and kind of seeing the big perspective, and as well as being your own PR. Like, talk about your wins and explain that in hindsight, because a lot of times in the midst of things, people get confused, and we know about the stadium, we know about the indoor turf ring, and in the midst of it, it's a lot of angst and doomsday thought processing that goes there. But I did want to ask this outside of communication. You said that you want to complete a project, put it aside, and move on to the next thing. How does the government make sure that this here doesn't become siloed from what's next, and that it stays included in the larger vision that you may have for the community?
I think that's a great question. And I used the two big projects that we did as a community, not the city, as a community, you know, and there was political differences while they moved alongside one another, the indoor turf complex and the stadium, right? And from the outset, because of those differences, it was as if they were, you know, miles apart. And they're within like 3 or 4 blocks of each other. And I think that we shoot ourselves in the foot oftentimes in this community by doing exactly that, by siloing some of these major efforts that we take on.
Agreed.
And not interconnecting them. And here's an example. When the stadium was happening, and if you go to the south end, everybody sort of used that cut through, right, to get to Summit, to go around Park Circle. There's a service station there. And I pushed and pushed for years to say, if we're really going to interconnect City Park with the A&E Trail, with downtown, you've got to address the service station that's sitting there empty, because it sort of creates a literal, physical, visual barrier between the two.
100%.
And so we were able to get that property and take it down. You know, there was interest and effort put into, you know, creating a park space there. And by creating that park space, it created interconnectivity. And I don't feel like we do that enough with the physical improvements that we make individually around our urban core.
I agree. We talk about the Barbara Ingram. We talk about the Maryland Theater, all major initiatives that seem that, okay, we're done with that, now we're moving on to this. How do we connect all those projects? And I would love to see your book. What happens if you take that book and you turn it into a strategic plan, you know, 2025, 2050, whatever it looks like. What's that vision?
So I guess it was when I got back on council in 2013. So about the 2014 timeframe, I went to the Greater Hagerstown Committee folks, and they had a committee done. I said, listen, it appears what government has been attempting to do over the last several decades with public funding is we identify, you know, something bad on one of the blocks downtown, and we go, how can we fix this up, right? And we put the money there, and we attempt to like invest in fixing that up. I said, what we should be doing, I said, everybody that drives around town can recall that particular bad property on that block that needs to go. You don't recall the good stuff on that block, you recall that bad property. I said, we need to start removing the bad. because the bad is dragging the marginal down, and the marginal isn't allowing those anchor spaces to thrive. If we remove the bad and figure out what to redo with the land, the marginal will then rise and it'll bolster that anchor property. And I don't think the Y really functions any differently than that in the grand scheme of things. So for me, I said we should create this plan that goes block by block and points out, okay, what are those barriers? What are those blight and dilapidation that is negatively impacting this block? How do we remove it so that we can make the other 70% of the stuff that is good about that block better?
And remove and replace, of course.
Yes.
We need to take another break, so hope you'll stay with us for one or two more segments.
Okay.
And I hope you'll stay with us as well. We'll be back after these messages. Welcome back. We're once again here with Kristen Aleshire, council member for the city of Hagerstown. Like every community, Hagerstown has its challenges. What is on your list of things that you would like to see addressed? What are you working on from a challenge perspective?
I think that the challenge that we are working on now as a body is similar to the ongoing challenges that we've worked on for some time, which are those social challenges. Two things I'll say about that. If you, a long-time resident, new resident of the community, the two things that I would note is, when I go down to MML convention and you go to the large city forum, right? They have the small city forum and all the towns go there, and then you have the large city forum and all the folks from the larger cities go to that forum. It doesn't matter whether it's Westminster or Salisbury or Frederick or Hagerstown or Rockville, et cetera, in the room. We all have very similar social challenges. Mm-hmm. That's a reality. In an urban space of this size, it's just a reality, and we're not unique. The other thing I'll say is, because I work for a small town in Frederick County, and I'm up here, I get to sort of, not so much anymore, but I get to see the two newspapers, right? And it used to be, look what's going on in Hagerstown. I would look at both papers and I'd be like, okay, they're the same issues. It's just they're not accentuated because you're not focused on that other community. And so for us, I like the initiative, and I credit Councilmember Burnett specifically with pushing this forward, is really sort of taking to heart those issues that require some redress of our review of our ordinances to make sure we're doing what we can to create and express a safe, livable community. And so, for last week, the week before, for the weeks we have coming up, we're taking a good bit of time looking through our ordinances and looking at the activities of our community and saying, okay, are these ordinances adequate? Are they up to date? Do they apply to the society and the community of today? And are there things we're missing? And one of the items that we talked about Tuesday was, people don't realize, but about half of all of the apartments in the city are owned by individuals from outside of the city and largely well outside of the area, and there's no local contact that the city has with those individuals and those owners. There's no communication at times with folks that are property managers mm-hmm. of some of those properties. I don't think that there's any checks and balances on some of the recovery house facilities that open up, on the ability for folks to engage in finding a place to rent And so, when we talked about, we did the hotel ordinance. So I think there's pushback to all of those things often, but it's sort of that double-edged sword where we're trying to address, some of the social issues. We're trying to address some of the housing issues and those activity issues. And it's like folks don't want us to enact legislation that accomplishes some of that, but they want us to address the issue that exists. And the out of doors ordinance, right? That was a big one in the last few months. And I said the same, and I'll say the same thing here that I did then. To me, that ordinance didn't matter whether it got passed or not, because there's a reality. It applies to city property, right? You can't live out of doors on city property. That's all it says. That's all it really says. But here's, the city owns parks. It owns streets and sidewalks. It owns parking lots. And it owns sensitive areas like water and sewer facilities. You can't be on those water and sewer facility properties. They're not open and available to anybody.
Right.
You can't block the public sidewalk. That's already a law. You can't like set up shop in the street. And nobody, all of our parks close at dark. So everybody has to leave the parks at dark anyway. So all of these laws already existed. And when I tried to tell a lot of people who sent us a lot of emails about it, was they already exist. We can already enforce that. I feel like what this law said is this time we mean it. In other words, if you're going to become combative over the issue, then it provides that tool for our police department, to say, hey, these are the rules, and you have to follow those rules. And what happens beyond that, and I think they've enforced it 23 times over the first month. Nobody's gotten
the biggest pushback.
I think this assertion that individuals should be allowed to live in the parks. That the city have an automatic answer when it engages an individual. And we can direct that, and I use this example. So the chief made a presentation to us yesterday. For the first 30 days this has been active, and 23 people were engaged by HPD using this ordinance. 15 of that 23 I think were complaint driven, meaning somebody called and said, hey, I've got this individual. 12 on public property and 12 were on private property. And the police are engaging individuals. Out of that 23, I think there were 15 out of that 23 that said, yeah, we're aware of services, but we're not interested. And it's like, I don't, in those instances, I don't know what more, we can do. And so it's like they want the legislation, but they don't want the enforcement, but they don't want to see the issue, but, they want us to address it. And I think that we try and enact our codes to the degree we're able, reasonably, understanding that they're our codes. Meaning, once you get past that point, we don't control the courts. You know what I mean? We don't control state law. We have to operate within federal parameters of what we're allowed to do. And frankly speaking, there are 600 plus nonprofits within Washington County.
More than that.
More than that.
We don't own, operate, or fund any of them. We can't determine, how they operate, who they're going to provide service to, how that intake process goes, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that there's just this assumption from time to time that because you're government, that you control all these things.
Yeah.
And we just don't.
My favorite 2 words in Facebook posts? They should.
Yes.
The Sears building. They should. And they, of course, is directed at you. So it should be Kristen should.
Yeah.
But they don't say Kristen should. They don't say this. They should. And I so much want to reply to all of those comments and say, who is they? This is privately owned property. The city has no jurisdiction to determine what can or can't be done with it, as long as it's within the legal limits of, you know, what you can do with your property. What do you mean they should?
Yeah, I think that we get that, you know, more often than not. And I feel like at times when we pass legislation to sort of address some of those issues, there's pushback, you know, to what those are. I'll give an example. So the chief came in and he spoke to us about a month or so ago, loitering. Now, loitering is an enforceable item in the state of Maryland, but only if that individual is harassing another individual, or if that individual is blocking a passage to that other individual. You know, folks come in and say, "Oh, I can't believe you're letting those 6 people sit on the park bench or the benches in downtown square." Well, it's in the public space. Those are benches.
Yeah.
There is no law that allows government to go and say, "Hey, you know, you got to get out of here. You're not allowed to sit on that bench. You know, you're wearing the wrong clothing." It just
How many people
that
know
kind
that,
of
though?
stuff. I don't think a lot.
Well, see, that's
don't
the
think a lot.
problem. That's the problem, and that's the problem with social media.
And so I think that it has been really good for us to sort of go through these steps and review our code, and you know, speak with all of those partners within the community, because we've had at least 3 meetings that I can recall in the last year or so where we've invited partners in from the nonprofit social services community, you know, to give us as much information as we're giving them in terms of that conversation, and really sort of figure out, you know, what it is we can and can't do, what it is we're looking for, what it is we're striving to achieve. And at the end of the day, I think you also have to recognize that maybe what you're trying to achieve at times to meet citizen expectation isn't what the nonprofit's objective is in serving the individuals that they serve. And so you have to find, you know, some amicable, some positive common ground and compromise so that they are able to meet.
We need to take a break, and there is a massive subject we haven't dealt with, which is water, and we'll talk about that when we come back. Stay with us. We'll be back with Kristen Aleshire after this. Welcome back. Well, we're going to wrap up this evening with Kristen Aleshire, council member for the city of Hagerstown. We want to talk about water, but you wanted to address something first, Terrence.
We're wrapping the last segment. We were talking about education, and I wanted to say, how do we teach community how to fish? Where do we can go to look for information? There's so much information out there, and social media is not it, right? I don't want to learn from people's opinions. I really want to learn from hard, accurate, factual data that I can go seek out. Where do I learn that, and what opportunities does the city have to provide that?
So I think 2 things. One is I use Washington County government because I follow their Facebook page, and I will say, you know, in recent months they are doing a very good job of delivering county governmental operations information to the public in a concise sort of here's what we do and here's what we're doing manner. I think whoever's doing that over there is doing a very good job at that. Because, well, I agree, I don't want to go to social media to learn all that stuff. People aren't going to the websites of government to learn that stuff anymore. They want real time, you know, they want soundbite, social media oriented driven, you know, processes for that. And I think that what we need to do a better job of as a city, in that, because I feel like government's sort of catching up to the social media game, right? You know, and I think what we need to do a better job of is constructing the narrative of the storyline of those things before the other individuals are able to do in those social media arenas. I think we can do a better job at that, and I just use the Washington County example because I think they've been doing that in recent months, whether it's you know, the bridge operations, the wreck on the 81 today, the you know, hiring of employees, et cetera, et cetera. They're just doing it in a very sort of, you know, we'd probably put those on our website But what we would put on our website, we're just going to start putting out on social media in these sound bites of a very, finite government operation. Here's what we're doing, that doesn't allow for the narrative to be, taken off in tangents. I think the city's a little harder in that regard because I feel like it's a bit more fast-paced,
More dynamic
activity, to do that.
Well, I'm going to switch gears totally. Let's talk water. Water has been a consistent subject with the city, with the county. People talk about what impact it potentially has on development, and are we not able to build the houses that we need to build because we don't have the water to support them? And is the city keeping all of the water for themselves and not letting the county?
Sure. So a couple of things.
And keep it in layman's terms, because I've heard this at a high level.
That's okay.
Very high level. So please.
So the city's water infrastructure stretches like fingers through a broad area of the county. We actually have more water customers outside of the city than we do inside of the city, right? And the reality is, any property owner that has ever come to the city to request water service has gotten it. So this notion out there in politics land that the city's hoarding the water is just not true. If somebody comes in, we have traditionally said yes, and that has to be within reason because there's cost associated with that provision. So that's one myth I'll dispel. The second is when you ask if there's enough water, and I say this in every venue that I speak about this, it isn't just about if there's enough. It's about if you can get it there. So it's about quantity and it's about pressure. And so we are wrestling with those two issues because we can get it out of the Potomac, we can put it up in the towers, but the amount of property that wants to develop, that wants the water, we got to make sure we can keep everybody's pressure up high enough to receive the water. And here's where I have, I think, maybe a bit of a differing opinion in terms of quantity and pressure. We have operated the Edgemont Reservoir for a century. And it wasn't until recent years where the state came in and said, hey, we've got some issues. So the reservoir is typically, let's say it's 100 feet deep, right? If you go up there, it's a beautiful site. So it's 100 feet deep. The guys that built it, a century ago knew what they were doing. Mm-hmm. Built this huge, holding area in exactly the right place. Most of that water then came down to the city. It's what provided the water to the city for some time, for some decades. And when it gets up to about 80 feet, there's some seepage at the base of the dam. So we got to address that issue. Mm-hmm. And so we said, okay, we'll empty it, we'll address that issue. And then the state says, okay, and this is 2016, right? And it's about $8 million project. And the state comes along and says, okay, well, your spillway, it's got some issues, got some cracking in the concrete. If you go up there, the concrete might be like a 1/4 inch separated. And I just have a different opinion on that because that spillway, will be there another century before it needs real attention. Mm-hmm. And it can handle, when that reservoir gets up to 100 feet of that spillway, going over and working the way it's supposed to. But that adds another $8 million. So in 2016, when we were going to fix it and put that system back in service, and every step of the way, the state is sort of like adds a hurdle. In my opinion, we're now 2025, and now that's like a $35 million project to do a bunch of stuff that I think is unnecessary. And that reservoir holds 100 million gallons. We use about 10 to 13 million gallons a day, right? So I know that we can't deliver that to the city. Even on our best day, the plant, if we put it back up in full operation, can maybe deliver about 4 million gallons, right, in a day. It can do 800,000 a day regularly. But here's the problem. We're on a 12-hour schedule, meaning every drop of water we take out of the Potomac, we've got to treat, put it up in the tower, send it down to the system every 12 hours. It's rolling. There is no reserve just sitting anywhere in the event that the Potomac system goes down. In my opinion, the folks that built the reservoir 100 years ago, that was great foresight to say there's a 100 million gallon reservoir. Even if we went down for a few hours, you could pump 4 million gallons through that system into the system. And where do we have the worst pressure? On the east end of the town. So where does the water come from the Edgemont Reservoir? It comes from the Smithsburg area into that east end of the town. And to still be sitting here nearly 10 years later and not have that issue resolved and not have that reservoir back up and running, because in my opinion, I believe that state policy doesn't want us to have that reservoir back up in operation, because it does, pull out of a stream system. And I'll say the same thing to you guys that I said to the state folks at MML this year. At some point when it comes to that, and you want development to still occur and you want this state to still grow, you're going to have to decide in those small systems whether it's the fish or the humans. Because we cannot go without that system, and we cannot depend on a system to get up to 20 million gallons a day all out of the Potomac that's all got to be treated and sent into the system all at the same time, and say, well, if it goes down for a day, half the system's out of water. It can't work that way. And I know that there's this alternative idea to put a 5 million gallon plant on the Antietam Creek. I don't think the Antietam Creek in a good summer will produce 5 million gallons and still allow the adequate flow by, because you got to have so much that flows by. And I don't know that I am interested in the quality of the water in the Antietam Creek versus the quality of the water up on that mountain at Edgemont Reservoir.
So it's an environmental conservation issue that is being pushed by the state. Is one of the biggest.
My opinion.
Okay, it was an obstacle for your opinion. Okay, and how about cost and maintenance?
For the Edgemont Reservoir?
Yes.
I mean, all the infrastructure is pretty much there.
Okay.
We've been doing that for a century. And I just, when the state says, hey, we'll give you money if you build a plant on Antietam Creek, but we won't, if you're going to put this reservoir back in operation, it's clearly an environmental and conservation, philosophical difference of opinion. In fact, one of the things I said when they started looking at the Antietam, I said, okay, well, there's three quarries in the area. The only way I'll agree that the Antietam is a better idea is if you can tell me that you're going to connect a line to the quarries out in that area in the event that, that water system isn't adequate. Because, we're at 13 million gallons now, we go up to 18 million gallons, we're going to have some plan in place, like just about every other jurisdiction does in the state of Maryland, to ensure that you have some reservoir type capacity, storage capacity, in the event that you need it. And the more different places that you have, those parts of the system feeding in, the better pressure you're able to regulate within that system as it sort of feeds into the middle.
Well, and the more backup you have.
Oh, 100%, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that used to be the thing in the 90s. They'd ask you the question, how much storage capacity do you have? That was a question. And it's so odd to me that isn't at the forefront of the thought process for what our next 20 years worth of water service, stability looks like.
So what's the risk?
It will be when we have a problem, not if. When we have a problem,
right?
It'll come to the forefront.
I'll give you an example. The main transmission lines out of the Potomac up to to the treatment and then up to the facility. Some of those main transmission lines are from the 50s. They've went down from time to time where the joints are. I know Nancy will kill me if I mess this up, but they're like asbestos lined joints. You know what I mean? And so, they have a life cycle.
Right.
And they're starting to get those joints to the point of their life cycle. Well, to fix each one of those, you got to take the plant out of service for 12 hours and then bring it back in. That's if you can get it fixed. And you got to make sure that the tower then is able to meet that
demand.
Supply for the day.
Right.
But if the tower's only holding 10 and a half and you get that day where it's 13,
that's a problem.
That's a problem.
Yeah.
And I just feel like, I remember telling the commissioners in 2008, that the fire and rescue was the 800-pound gorilla in the county room. Water stability is the 800-pound gorilla in the city's room, and it is not about this nonsense of who gets to control it and who gets to go to. It's about making sure that stability of that system.
That's the point I want to hit home, because the narrative is it's a debate between the city and the county, and no one's benefiting from being stalled because it's infighting. And that's not the narrative.
No, not at all.
And I'm going to give you the last word on that because we are out of time. All right, that's all the time we have for tonight. We hope you will like us on Facebook. Follow us on X. We hope you will send us your comments and feedback to feedback@flipsidetv.com. That's feedback@flipsidetv.com. Most importantly, join us again next week for another visit to the Flip Side. Good night.